Fergus mentioned an Irishman, and I immediately thought of another who spent a part of his life in Newgate jail. His name was Oscar Wilde. He said that to lose one wife was unfortunate, but to lose two was downright careless. I hope the same is not true of appointing two Irish people to chair the advisory board, that to appoint one might be considered unfortunate, but to appoint two is downright careless. But I thank you very much indeed for this opportunity, and I'd like just to say three things which I hope might help us as we shortly look at this vision for Australia. I came involved with the Global Foundation largely through my dear friend John Sanderson, who is both my close friend and also my best man, actually. And John inspired in me a lot of thinking in relation to both the land and in relation to the indigenous community. But I want to to mention, if I may, three things that I think are of significance. The first comes from my own experience in dealing with religious violence. I've spent a good part of my career involved with the ending of religious violence. And I'll only mention one of those. One was in the Solomons, one was in Ireland, but the one that was most significant for me was in Indonesia, where I took part in the ending of the violence in the eastern part of the country. And I was very inspired by the president of the country at that time, Abdurrahman Wahid, Gus Dur, with whom I worked. Gus Dur was a Muslim religious leader, almost completely blind, very enigmatic, somewhat unpredictable. I remember one night staying here in Melbourne in the Australia Club, and my bedroom door was knocked by Gus at about 1:15 in the morning. And he said, "James, we're going to have dinner." I said, "It's 1:15. He said, "Well, I've called the Consul General to meet us downstairs in 5 minutes." So down we went, and we found a cafe still open in Lygon Street. And there we had a meal from about 1:30 until about 3. And then we repaired to the front lounge of the Australia Club and continued the rest of the evening. I went to bed about 6 a.m. Gus went straight to the airport as he had a lecture in Sydney at 10. How he did it, I don't know. But during the hours of those early hours of the morning when we alone were awake, he gave me some very helpful insights into how we would eventually solve the problem of the violence in eastern Indonesia. And there were a number of issues. The first, he said, and I have never forgotten this, is there are such problems in the world that only citizens can solve them. There are such problems, often related to violence, where to leave it alone and not do anything about it is in itself an act of violence. You have to get in there and try and do something. And the second thing, which is the second point that I want to raise this evening, is that he also said to me in those early hours, which we implemented later on, that you cannot force upon the democratic process issues which the democratic process is not designed to solve. You cannot assume that the democratic process has to solve every issue. And in fact, the citizenry insult the government by assuming that the democratic process can in fact solve everything. There are certain points at which democratic decisions have to be made. There are certain points at which governments have to implement those things, but the process itself cannot do that. And he said that's the situation that we found ourselves in solving the problem in the Malacca Islands of eastern Indonesia. We went and we talked to all sides. We got everybody into the room. We reached an agreement known as Molino 1 and then later Molino 2, and there is peace. And the community came together. 8,000 people were killed, 500,000 made homeless, and the violence was appalling. I had to stand there as the graves were opened and all these half-decomposed bodies were taken out. You had to do it. And he said there is no point blaming the democratic process. It cannot deal with these things. But citizens have to deal with them. And that's, I think, the responsibility of a group like ourselves. To know the limits, that we have no democratic rights, absolutely none, but we have the rights to put forward the ideas which others may take up. And that is the highest thing that Gustur taught me. It's my third point. It is the power of humility. The power of humility. That is the ability to produce ideas, to look at the thing in a different way and allow others to take the credit for implementing them. At the end of the day, a group of citizens such as ourselves is primarily interested in seeing things happen without having to take credit. Now, the difficulty with the political process is that the political process has trouble dealing with failure. It has difficulty with putting up ideas, nailing their future to the mast, and then something outside of the control of the political process prevents that happening, and it's impossible to deal with. That also Gustur taught me. And therefore it is these three pictures, these three ideals, where we have an enormous chance to develop things. Now, in our time, communication is a difficulty. It may be that the citizenry is ahead of the political process, but it may also be that both the citizenry and the political process are light years ahead of the media, and that the media themselves, for very particular reason, are held in a time warp and are forced to see the world through lenses which no longer exist except in their mind. For example, we have seen enormous changes in tertiary education, in how you relate limited economic ability with the democratization of the provision of tertiary education, and yet the pundits in the media are stuck in a framework of a number of generations ago. It's easier, but again, that's where values and humility come in, that one simply has to cope with a media which simply may not be able to see exactly how the world is. Whether the formal media will be educated by the social media is another matter. My hunch is that the established media will try to control the social media, and that therefore there will not be much change. But it is this ability to have ideals, ideas, humility and determination, which is ultimately the symbol of an enlightened and caring citizenry. Thank you.